All right. So, welcome everyone to our event today. Um, we are lucky to be able to host Krista McCracken from the Shingwauk Residential School Centre today. I do want to start off with a land acknowledgement that specifically reflects where I live and work. So I wish to acknowledge the lands on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, Toronto has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas up the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I work on Toronto, often known as Toronto. I acknowledge that these lands have been stolen from its caretakers, and I acknowledge my own role as a settler in continuing the legacy of colonial violence and genocide. I also acknowledge that for some racialized non-Indigenous peoples, especially myself as an Afghan refugee, coming to Turtle Island was not a choice. Great. So again, welcome everyone. My name is Mosca and I work at the Institute of Islamic Studies at the University of Toronto. Specifically, I lead the Muslims in Canada archives. So we're going to start off today with some introductions. I'll introduce our wonderful guest, Krista, and the Shingwauk Residential School Centre. I'll really briefly touch on the Muslims in Canada archive as well, so where I work, and then I'll pass things over to Krista, who has a presentation lined up for you all. From there, I wanted to invite Krista to discuss community archiving, community-centered practices for a few minutes, and then, like I mentioned earlier, we'll open the space up for a Q&A to everybody else. All right, so now it's with great pleasure that I get to introduce the amazing Krista McCracken. Krista is an award-winning public historian and archivist. They are the interim director of the Shingwauk Residential School Centre at Algoma University. Krista's research focuses on community archives, residential schools, access, and outreach. Krista is an editor of the popular Canadian history website, activehistory.ca. They are the 2021-2022 president of the Archives Association of Ontario, which I'm also a director of, so I get to work with Krista very closely. They also serve as member of the Steering Committee on Canada's Archives, responds to the report on the Truth and Reconciliation Task Force. In 2020, they won the Best Article in Indigenous History Prize awarded by the Canadian Historical Association's Indigenous History Group for their article Challenging Colonial Spaces, Reconciliation and Decolonizing Work in Canada's Archives. They have two ongoing book projects, Decolonial Archival Futures with Skylie Storm Hogan, and Trans and Gender Diverse Voices in LIS with Kalani Adolfo and Stephen Kruger. Thank you, Krista, for being with us today. And like I mentioned, Krista is the current interim director of the Shingwauk Residential School Centre. So I just wanted to give a brief overview of the center. The Shingwauk Residential School Centre is an archival repository and cross-cultural education center within Algoma University with a special mandate to collect and preserve material relating to the legacy of residential schools in Canada, healing and reconciliation, and Indigenous communities. It is jointly governed by the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association and Algoma University. So one of the main reasons that I was very excited to do this event with Krista and the center was precisely because of this shared community-centered approach that both the center and MiCA shares. As I mentioned, I am the archivist for the Muslims in Canada Archive, or MiCA for short. It is a collaborative and participatory initiative at the Institute for Islamic Studies at the University of Toronto. MiCA provides a platform for the missing Muslim voices in Canada. And since this past summer, we've been hosting a series of webinars which we're calling the Community Collaboration Series, where we're trying to use our platform to share community archives and public history initiatives. So this is actually precisely why we knew we had to host the center and Krista today. Right. So, okay, I've taken up enough time already, I think. So I'm going to let Krista now share their screen for their presentation. Just one second. All right. Okay, Krista, please
Great.
take it away. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for that warm welcome. Can you see my screen? Good. Yeah. Okay. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Really want to start by acknowledging that I'm here as a settler, that I'm here as somebody who's worked for about a decade with Indigenous community archives, but that a lot of this work is really grounded in Indigenous community. And it's really the survivors that we need to acknowledge when talking about this work. Likewise, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm here in Robinson Huron Treaty Territory in Bawatang, or what's known as Sault Ste. Marie today, and specifically on the lands of Garden River First Nation, Batchewana First Nation, and the historic Métis community of Sault Ste. Marie. So kind of the game plan for today is we're going to talk a little bit about the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association, talk about the community archives that is the Shingwauk Residential School Centre, and then talk about some of the ways that the archives have been used for engagement and community building. And then we're going to have a chance for some dialogue as well. So where the Shingwauk Residential School Centre is located, we're housed in Algoma University. And Algoma University is located on the site of the Shingwauk Residential School. The Shingwauk Residential School operated from 1874 until 1970 in Sault Ste. Marie. There's two photos on the screen. The black and white photo shows what the original Shingwauk School looked like. That school was on the site from 1874 until 1935. In 1935, new Shingwauk Hall was built, and that's the color image that you see on the slide. That building, the colored photo, it operated as the residential school until 1970. And then Algoma University moved into the site in 1971, less than 6 months after the residential school had closed. Children came from all over to the Shingwauk Residential School. So from as far south as Sarnia, Walpole Island, as far north as the James Bay coast in northern Quebec, some from Western Canada and the United States. So really from all over. So though my talk is really grounded in Sault Ste. Marie, it's grounded in survivor community, that community really extends all over, all across Canada and into the United States today. So I think it's really important to remember where these communities are, where these families are, and where these individuals and these children are from. So the Shingwauk Residential School, as I said, closed in 1970. If you had have talked with a faculty member, a staff person at Algoma University in the 70s and said, this is an old building, what was it? Nobody would have said it was a residential school. There was a lack of knowledge around that history. There was also some kind of intentional forgetting and not wanting to acknowledge this past. It really was initially the survivors, people like Dan Pine Sr., who's pictured on this slide here, who were the ones who said, we need to talk about this history. We need to come together. We need to be able to preserve this history. We need to be able to share it with community. And we're the ones who this site matters to the most. So sorry, my phone was just ringing beside me. I didn't mute it. So in the 1981, the first Shingwauk reunion was held. And this was designed as a school reunion, just inviting former students back to the residential school. There really wasn't a sense as to who would want to come back to a residential school. Also thinking about the 1980s, there's not a national conversation going on about residential schools yet. There's actually still residential schools open at this point, the last one not closing until 1996. But over 300 people showed up to that reunion in 1981 because there really was a desire for people to begin to talk about what happened at residential schools. So some of the things that happened at that first reunion were people wanting their experiences recorded, both on audio and video, but also people wanting a way to be able to share photographs and documents with each other. And that's really how the grassroots archive that became the Shingwauk Residential School Centre was started. It was started as a way to collect the history of residential schools from the survivor perspective and to really counter the narratives that were out there from the church perspective and the government perspective, making sure that this archive was dedicated to survivors and it was kind of by and for survivors. And so community archives, I think, matter for so many reasons, but in the case of the Shingwauk Residential School Centre, it's really tied to both cultural reclamation, to identity building, to transferring knowledge about residential schools between generations. It's also been an integral part of very many people's healing journeys. For some people, the material that's held in the archive is the only material connected to either their own time at residential school or a relative's time at the residential school. So being able to see a single photograph or their name in a register can be a really powerful way to connect to that past and begin to work through what that past means as an individual or as a family or community. So the Shingwauk Residential School Centre today is still really driven by that group of survivors that started to gather in 1981. The policies that govern the center in terms of our collection policies, how our donation processes work, how our descriptive processes work, they're guided by the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association. And really all the projects that we're undertaking, be that outreach projects like exhibit development or community tours, or the public facing programming is really rooted in survivor needs and community priorities. Part of that is recognizing that the people who went to the residential school, they're really the experts. They've been working on telling this history for over 40 years at this point, and I'm just here to help support that. It's my job to help preserve that history, but it isn't my job to decide what's going to be shared or how it's going to be shared. That is really coming from community. And doing that in a way that's including communities so that they're not only like an advisory voice, but they're actively involved in the process of being paid for their time and being supported however we can throughout that process. So I'd say the Shingwauk Residential School Centre also is guided by some general principles, things like OCAP that really look at Indigenous ownership, control, access, and possession of records. OCAP was originally designed to look at First Nation like health information, but I think it has a lot of applications with archives, thinking about how archives are managed and who is responsible for the archive material. The Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association essentially own the material in the archives here. They're the ones who decide how it's shared, who gets access, and how that material is displayed to the general public. So one of the other pieces that comes with dealing with residential school records is that a lot of those records were created by church organizations, government organizations, staff who worked in the residential school. And so under Western copyright, that material belongs to who created it. But really challenging that through the Shingwauk Residential School Centre by thinking about Indigenous intellectual property rights, recognizing that the children in, say, residential school photos, they didn't have a chance to say, no, I don't want my photo taken. But the survivors today have the right to be able to say, no, I don't want that shared, or yes, I want that material shared. Really trying to support the agency of survivors and their willingness to share information or not share information. And I think that's really where it comes down to that public domain versus ethical access piece. Just because something connected to residential schools is in the public domain does not mean it's necessarily okay to share it. A lot of it has to do with individual experiences of residential school, and we work really closely with the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association to determine access protocols, privacy protocols, and community-based protocols for all the material that's donated to the residential school center. So I'm going to shift to talk a little bit about some of the specific programs that have come out of the Shingwauk Residential School Center. The first one is the Remember the Children project. So this was started in the early 2000s and really as a pilot project initially focused on the residential schools that were in Spanish Ontario. But it was a project that was aimed to bring photographs into community. And so creating reproduction photo albums and essentially just bringing them into community and saying, we have these photos, we want to connect with the people in the photos or people who might know the people in the photos. One of the challenges with residential school photos is often the students aren't named in the images. So this project also served another purpose of trying to identify the students who were in the photos, really encouraging community members to write directly on the albums if they remembered anybody in the photos or even knew any of that contextual information. The initial pilot project, like I said, focused on that one set of residential schools in Spanish Ontario, but it had about a 40% identification rate, the first pilot phase of it, which I think is pretty huge considering going into that project of the thousands of photos, almost none of them had any student names attached to them. And being able to identify 40% of them and then, give updated copies of those photo albums to community, to family, I think is really important. This project since the 2000s has really expanded to, we have photo albums for every residential school in Ontario, as well as some photo albums for other provinces and other residential schools outside of Ontario. But it continues to be one of the most frequently used resources in the Shingwauk Residential School Centre. People show up and are like, I heard you have photos. Can I look at them? And that's really how we operate as a community-based archive. It's a space that's really accessible to drop-ins as well as just people wanting to learn more. It's changed a little bit with COVID having to be by appointment, but I'd say that feel of having an open door is something that kind of underlies the Shingwauk Residential School Centre services. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the physical building of the residential school and how commemoration and the archives have been treated. So the picture on the slides here show you what the main entrance to the residential school looked like or continues to look like. The color photo is those main doors to the residential school today. Those doors really significant because of how people's lives changed when they entered through those doors. Many survivors, that was a very traumatic experience. It represented their change from home life to the residential school system. And the doors themselves just hold that emotional weight. A few years ago, Algoma University was doing energy efficiency upgrades. One of the discussions was around, should we replace these doors? The doors are from 1935. They don't close tightly. They're not airtight. They're not up to energy efficiency standards or any of that. But it really, as soon as the survivors heard that plan, they said, you need to stop. These doors represent so much of our lives, so much of what happened to us, that it's really important that you leave them here as a way to talk about residential school. It's a way to show what this building was like. So the doors are still there and will be there for the foreseeable future. But I think that's one example of how the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association have really advocated for the preservation of the physical building of a residential school, but also advocated for truth-telling and the awareness building within the community at Algoma University. And so part of that has resulted in, right through those doors now, is the Reclaiming Shingwauk Hall exhibition space. So it's in a fully functioning hallway within the university. It's an administrative hallway. Lots of offices. The president's office for the university is in this hallway even. But it's now a space that when you enter through those doors, it's really clear that this was a residential school. And the space opened in 2018, but represents, work since 1981 by survivors to have their experiences shared, to have them told on the walls of the former residential school. The first gallery space in that hallway is called Life at Shingwauk, and it really talks about what daily life was like for survivors. So all the way from the 1870s up until 1970, and talking about the daily work at the residential schools, as well as, food schedule, what individual experiences were like. But I'd say for me, the panels in there, they're only telling part of the story. And part of that has to do with the nature of the archival record. And so this panel here, that's called Missing Evidence, is probably my favorite panel in the whole exhibition, because it's really talking about the archival record itself and talking about the fact that, the photos that you're seeing on the wall are not showing the entire story. The smiling faces don't necessarily mean that the students had a good time at residential school. That's not the case. And really inviting visitors and people who are engaging in material held in the Shingwauk Residential School Centre to consider the context of how these records were created, and to consider what information isn't in the photos. What aren't you seeing here? And how can we learn about residential schools in a way that goes beyond just the images that you're seeing? So one of the things that, going beyond just those images, the Life at Shingwauk gallery is paired with a gallery called Children of Shingwauk, or We Are All Children of Shingwauk. And it's really looking at survivors and survivor resilience. It's looking at family connections to residential school and current Anishinaabe student success at Algoma University. And I think having these two gallery spaces paired against each other is a good way to kind of talk about the archive itself, but also the experience of residential school. So you're getting the archival record, then you're also getting the survivor voice, which I think balancing those two is so important. And that's really what community archives is about in some sense, is pairing those textual records with that community voice. So the last gallery space that was part of the original installation in 2018 was called From Teaching Wigwam to Residential School. It's definitely a more text-heavy section, but it is really looking at what the kind of legal context, the colonial context was behind residential schools. It also talks about the Shingwauk school specifically and looking at Chief Shingwauk Oates. So the Shingwauk Residential School, somewhat unusual in how it was named. It's named after Chief Shingwauk Oates, who was from Garden River First Nation. And most residential schools were named after either religious figures or the place they were located. But Chief Shingwauk, he had a vision for education for his people. And that vision we now talk about as teaching wigwams. This idea that Anishinaabe people could learn alongside white settlers, but white settlers would learn from Anishinaabe people as well. So really a sharing of learning environments, a sharing of knowledge. Today it's often called cross-cultural education. Chief Shingwauk wanted a school. He did not want a residential school. He worked, or his descendants also worked with the first principal of the residential school. I'd say that relationship is really fraught in many ways. Also, as the church and the government became more involved, the residential school became like residential schools all across Canada, really designed to take away the language, culture, and identity of Indigenous children. The reason I think it's important to talk about Chief Shingwauk is that vision is something that the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association, people like Dan Pine that I mentioned earlier, have come back to again and again as the original purpose for the Shingwauk site, a site that is meant to be for cross-cultural education, that's for learning for everybody, and really sharing Anishinaabe knowledge and non-Anishinaabe knowledge with the community as a whole. So there's one more gallery space that got added in 2019. It's the Shingwauk Schools Gallery, and it was added, about a year after that original 3 galleries were added. It's in more of a vestibule space, so there's a bit more space to walk around. It's not in an active hallway. So it actually has some artifacts in it. It tells a very similar story to what the hallway is talking about, but it does so through objects. And the words in this section are all survivor quotes primarily. So as a way to, again, forefront that survivor voices. I'd say one of the things that makes this space special is how involved survivors were in picking out the objects that were in the space. The sewing machine that's there, it actually belonged to Fran, who's pictured on this slide. And Fran attended 2 residential schools, the residential school that was in Chapleau, Ontario, and then the Shingwauk Residential School. Fran is somebody that I was lucky enough to spend a lot of time with. She did a lot of education programming with elementary school students for us. But she spent a lot of time working in the sewing room when she was at residential school. A lot of time darning socks, a lot of time mending uniforms, a lot of time doing that manual labor of sewing and mending. But after she left residential school, the sewing machine, this is the one she bought for herself. And it was a sewing machine that she used to make clothes for herself, for her family, and for her community. And she really wanted it included in the exhibit as a way to talk about the fact that, yes, residential schools made her sew, they made her learn these skills, but what she did with it after, that was up to her. And she wanted to talk about that kind of positive impact that sewing had on her community. And so I think, again, this gallery space really centered in survivor voices is important, and recognizing that each survivor has a very individual experience of residential school, and that you're just seeing glimpses of it, especially through, a presentation like this. I'm giving you highlights, but wanting to recognize that survivors and individuals who attended residential school all had a unique experience. There's definitely commonalities across them, but needing to acknowledge that individualism, I think, is important. And so kind of to go back to thinking about the archives as a community space, thinking about how do you talk about residential schools? How do you center the voices of survivors? How do you do that for a residential school that existed from the 1870s until 1970? So one of the challenges, for example, of the exhibition space was, how do you talk about people who attended the residential school in the 1800s? So in the case of the Shingwauk Residential School, we do have records of some of the first students who attended the residential school, as well as some photographs of them. But a lot of those records, they're written by the first principal of the residential school. And so wanting to, especially when visitors come, make sure that they're aware that, if that text was written by the principal, that they're reading it through that lens. I think in terms of including the voices naming the students who we know their names of is really important. That act of naming someone, putting them into the historical record, can be really powerful. Talking about residential schools can be challenging. It can be a fine line of trying to balance truth-telling versus triggers or emotional roller coasters in some cases. There's a photo of a dormitory on this space. This photo is actually in the Reclaiming Shingwauk Hall exhibition. But we had a lot of conversations about, was it okay to include a dormitory photo? Because for many students, dormitories were not a safe place. Ultimately, the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association, through consensus building, through community conversations and circles, decided, yes, they wanted this image included. They wanted to be able to talk about the dorms. They wanted to be able to talk about that difficult part of residential school. And I think that piece, how that decision came about, is really important because it's about community consent. It's about survivor decision making. It's, you know, not me as a curator or as an archivist making that decision. It's the community members. So I'm going to leave it there. And then I think we can have a conversation that dives a little bit more into that community archive piece. And then there'll be time for questions too.
Yeah, thank you so much, Krista. That was really great, and I mean, I've read up on the Shingwauk Residential School Centre before, but I really appreciate all the detail, especially the history of it, because I know, I mean, you did mention that the center closed in 1970, was it? Yeah, so and I did notice that there were occasional reunions, and I wasn't 100% sure how those related to the current center. So that was really helpful. I guess what I want to kind of bring up first is just this the Alumni Association that was created, and I think you mentioned it was created after one of the reunions. Yeah, so I did want to ask because it's you mentioned that the Alumni Association and Algoma University kind of both jointly equally share the archive. Is that is that correct?
So they jointly manage the archive. Yeah.
Oh, okay, okay. So first of all, amazing that, you know, a community archive like this can be a lot of the decision making can be done by this the actual community members that are represented in archive, which is it's a really great model, and something we're trying to do here at MiCA as well, with our own steering committee of community members and community organizations. I'm just wondering how, I guess, they came about deciding on an archive, and how that you know, how the decision making works, and how, yeah.
And so I think the decision to make an archive was kind of by accident, to be honest. It initially started in a professor's office as really just a stack of paper, a stack of records that were very dear to community, but not sure how to best make them accessible to each other. The project was entirely volunteer run until the early 2000s, at which point they had some contract staff. When I was hired in 2010, I was the first person with any archival background that was hired to work in the residential school center. And that was really after pushing from the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association, pushing the university to be like, you need to uphold your part of this partnership. And that part is giving us the space, giving us some resources to help support professionalizing the archive and making it more accessible to community. So today, the partnership between the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association and Algoma University is governed under a formal MOU that kind of dictates each side's responsibilities to the partnership. That MOU also does really state that it is the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association who own the material in the archive. It's a partnership, but the survivors, I think, have that kind of underpinning all of the work is that it's theirs. They're the ones who've been doing this work for 40 years, and the university is there to support that work.
Oh, so actually on that now, so one of the things both the center and MiCA shares is this affiliation with a major institution, and I wonder how that decision was made. I know for the Muslim community, for example, there are not many. It is a bit of a divide. There's a lot of hesitancy to be affiliated with a major government-funded sort of university, and there's some distrust there with major institutions, for example. And so I'm just wondering how the Alumni Association contends with that, and what kind of relationship they have with the university.
Yeah, and I think because the Shingwauk Residential School Centre and the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association more specifically have been doing this work since the 80s, that
Right.
a lot of the donations and materials that we get are actually because of the Alumni Association. They're recognizing the work of survivors in community. And that makes people feel comfortable donating the material because they know they're going to be able to preserve it in a good way. Yes,
Mhm.
we're housed at a university, but I think the oversight by survivors is really important, and that that's kind of the driving force behind the community archives. That being said, I mean, like any two organizations that are partnered with each other, there's going to be challenges. And I'm sure, I mean, working with U of T is the same. There's going to be ups
Yeah.
and downs.
Yeah.
But I think there are some advantages to, you know, having that partnership, having that relationship. Say one of the bigger challenges for us is the fact that, you know, we're located in a former residential school. That is its own challenge. I think it's really good in terms of preservation, in terms of community awareness, but there's also survivors that we work with who won't come on the site because of the emotional and traumatic responses connected to the
Absolutely.
residential school. Yeah.
Mhm. And I absolutely understand. I think yeah, it's going to depend on the community member, of course, their own traumas, their own relationships with the institution. I think a big difference is this committed involvement by the community, by the survivors especially. So I'm wondering how the Alumni Association is made up then. Is it like a formal organization? How do you work with them yourself actually?
Yeah. So I'd say the structure of the organization has changed over the years. It initially started very grassroots, very, it's still very community oriented, but it was more informal at different periods of time. They do have a formal governance structure in place now that includes like a president, a vice president, secretary, that type of piece. For the Shingwauk Residential School Centre, we work closely with the executive, but there's also a separate committee called the Heritage Committee. And the Heritage Committee is specifically assigned to work with the residential school center. So if there's policy pieces or questions around access, things like that, that we have someone direct that we can go to. And they've basically been assigned the heritage file for children of Shingwauk. And then if they have questions, they go back to the executive or the broader CSA community.
I see. Okay. Yeah, for us for now, we have it's kind of a steering committee, kind of a similar situation. Though it's not too formalized. We do have a little bit of I think we have an MOU with a couple of the organizations, but um, it is a partnership with multiple like Muslim-led organizations, and we're trying to figure out a way to have them more involved. We've had I don't know how often you might meet with the Alumni Association, but we've had maybe 2 or 3 like big consultation meetings with them, and to see what their priorities are and see what kinds of things they want us to do honestly, and what kinds of things are on their mind at the time. But those are difficult to manage, but because there's just so many people involved. But at the same time, it has led to like a lot of changes and a lot of ways that I'm kind of orienting my approach to certain things, and prioritizing, like collecting priorities, for example. Is it safe to say it's a similar probably situation for you?
Yeah, and I'd say there's definitely periods where CSA meets more often than others. Um, the Children of Shingwauk also, they're involved in a range of other things. The center isn't the only thing that they do. And so if there's something that we're working on that we need survivor feedback, there's a special meeting held specifically for that. Just recognizing how busy the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association are. They're some of the busiest retired folks that I know.
Wow. Okay. So I wonder, one of the topics I really wanted to talk about to you about, especially, is I don't get to talk a lot with other community archives. I think just being within a university, surrounded by archives that document the activities of their own institution. So there's just a lot of institutional type of archives around me. So I don't get to talk about this very often, but I really wanted to talk to you about this idea of like the authentic, original, like untouched record, and what that, and for me on my end, being part of the University of Toronto, there is a lot of focus on that original record, and we are trying to see how we can kind of be flexible there, and in terms of what that means for the university. So I wonder if you've had to deal with that at Algoma or with the center as well.
So I think we're probably a bit more flexible than some places when it comes to what is a record or what is the original record. And I think part of that is recognizing how separated communities have been from their own archives, from material that represents their personal lives, their histories, their pasts.
Yeah.
And if a community has records connected to residential school, they may not want to donate them. They may want to keep them in their community, which that's completely okay.
Yeah.
But they may want to be able to share them. And so that's something the Shingwauk Residential School Centre does, is we help, say, digitize records, make them accessible to other groups. So we're not holding the original, but we're still holding the record in some way and helping preserve that history. Likewise, I think with residential schools, having to think about how those records were created and how residential schools themselves were organized, thinking about how church organizations were involved, government organizations were involved, and how dispersed those records became. So there's some records that we hold that are used really regularly that are actually, the originals are held by Library and Archives Canada. We just have copies of them, but those copies are so important to community and to community access, because in some cases they're the only attendance records for a residential school. And someone being able to find that name of themselves or a relative is so important. But being able to come into our space versus a Library and Archives Canada space, it's more accessible, different locations obviously as well, but also a completely different feel to it. We've got the comfy chairs, we've got the space where if people need to bring family with them, they can, and it's more of a community environment.
Absolutely, and I think it's so important to make sure that the at least for me anyway, that the records stay within the community that created them. So one of our challenges on our end was trying to figure out how to do that for an archive we're intending to be on a national scale. Like, how do we keep the records of a small town in Alberta near that town, and instead of having them come all the way here, because we're in Toronto. So I guess one of the ways we're attempting to do that is connecting with different archives, provincial archives, university archives in the regions that we're trying to acquire material. So we're trying to build relationships with different archives across the provinces, and trying to facilitate those conversations with Muslim communities in those regions, and then having the material go to an archive nearby in some way. Because you're right, that's so absolutely important, because the feel is so different. I've been to Library and Archives Canada. It's a massive, it's a national federal archive, so of course it's massive, it's huge, it's very imposing. I absolutely agree with the material, staying, we don't have comfy couches just yet. We're a very new archive, 2 years old so far. So we are trying, but when we are moving to a new space, and I'll make sure we put comfy couches on the list of furniture for the space. But I do agree with you. I think one of the ways we're trying to work with this idea of an original record is through potential oral histories. So I know you mentioned that one of the first few records that came about for after one of the reunions was this idea to wanting to share histories through audio and video, and as well as photographs, of course. And so I'm wondering if you have collections of like oral histories, and if this has been maybe a successful way of filling in those gaps and providing people alternative ways to record their histories, I guess.
And so definitely, especially those first few reunions. So like the one that happened in 1981, the second reunion was in 1991, and then the next one was in 1996. And then 2000, they started to get closer together as time went on. But a lot of those early reunions, they did include oral histories as part of it. So formal interviews as well as informal interviews.
Oh.
And so I think those records are actually some of the most valuable in the archives because they are really documenting survivors' thoughts very close to when the residential school closed. Some of the people in those interviews were interviewed more than once too. So they might have been interviewed at 1981 and then again in 1991, but providing real genuine insight into what happened at residential school, but also the survivor movement itself as it was starting to form across Canada and awareness was building around residential schools. So we actually recently just restarted an oral history project that's geared toward specifically continuing to document residential school survivors and intergenerational survivors of residential school, recognizing that, there's still this gap in knowledge, there's still this gap in, the formal archive, and wanting to be able to provide that community access, but still working with people that, it's up to them whether or not this material is shared and how it is shared, be that immediately or, maybe 25 years from now kind of thing.
Oh, so essentially the reunions became kind of spaces to like initiate oral history, interviews, oral history, recordings, as people came, obviously the main purpose of a reunion is to reminisce and talk about, so then it became a space for oral history recording. That's a really great idea, actually. It's probably a very natural way to also get those stories and thoughts out too.
Yeah, I think it's pretty significant. I think that this was happening as early as it was.
Yeah.
You think about the TRC not happening till like late 2000s, and this happening in 1981. What was recorded is very different in some cases than what was recorded in the TRC's report. In some cases, it's very similar. But the reunions themselves, I think, became a vehicle for what would become the archive, but also they're just that's community space that is so important. A community space for sharing like experiences. Today they're intergenerational, so really focused on education as well and learning and building shared community experiences.
I think the intergenerational part is very interesting. I think it's been more than 40 years. My math is probably wrong, but I think you mentioned it's been more than 40 years since the reunion started and the center closed. But I think, myself, I'm technically a first generation Afghan Muslim Canadian, and I grew up here, but I wasn't born here at the time. So trying to understand the Canadian Muslim history is a little bit different for me than those that actually came here much older, contribute to society, and lived through a lot of, created the foundations really for me to succeed in the Canadian Muslim society and in Canada and in general. Um, so I really like that you mentioned, that one of the purposes of the center was to counter narratives, and specifically focusing on survivor-centered narratives, and countering, church narratives and government narratives about residential schools. So I'm wondering if are there other residential school centers and archives that are similar to this, and if you know of them, or if you've done anything, if the center has done anything with them, has there been any sort of collaborations or anything like that?
Yeah, so I think there's some comparable ones, like the Woodland Cultural Center in Brantford is one example. They're located in the former Mohawk Indian Residential School, and do have a cultural center as well as an archive component. We've done some collaboration over the years, though I'd say on a limited basis. Since the TRC's conclusion, you now have the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation located in Manitoba. We also have UBC's Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center. And we've worked with both of those institutions. I would say that they're coming at this from a different kind of perspective. UBC is a post-custodial archive, so a little different in that most of their archives, they're kind of an aggregate. And the one at the University of Manitoba, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, its records really came out of that TRC process. And they do have a survivor oversight or a survivor committee advisory circle that oversees that, but it's a different structure in how the archive was created, which I think does make a difference, coming from community versus community kind of being imposed after the creation of the archive.
Almost reactionary versus like grassroots, emerging from, does that change how maybe like the next generations interact with the archive, you think? I guess, I mean, not the survivors, but maybe their descendants, and the intergenerational aspect of, I guess I'm wondering how that works.
That's a good question, and I'm not sure that I can speak adequately to how the like UBC and University of Manitoba's interaction is. I think it's interesting that like of UBC, University of Manitoba, and then Algoma, like we're all housed at universities.
Yes.
And thinking of the challenges associated with being attached to a mainstream organization, in organizations that, perpetuated the residential school system, perpetuate colonialism, and the challenges that come with that.
I wonder if we can open up, I guess, for Q&A now, unless you had anything else you wanted to.
No, I'm happy to open it up for if anyone else has questions.
Great. I think, so what we'll do is, if you have a question, if you can use the raise hand function, and then I will ask if you can unmute yourself, and then ask your question if you want to do it verbally. If not, we can answer any questions that come through in the chat, so you can type away. And I'll monitor the chat, so I can ask them to you, Krista, as they come. Does anybody have any questions to start? Hi, Erin. Please go ahead. You can unmute yourself.
Hi, Krista, and thank you for hosting MiCA. First of all, I would like to acknowledge my daughter turned on my camera on my laptop.
It's okay.
So that, good thing she's cute. I'm sorry if my camera was distracting the whole time.
Oh, not at all. You're okay.
So I wanted to just say that I've actually been meaning to send Krista an email, but you guys have covered a lot of the things that I've had questions about. As Krista knows, I head up the Manitoba Indigenous Tuberculosis History Project, where we are working primarily, we're centered around photos to sort of bring photos related to Indian hospitals and tuberculosis sanatoriums in Manitoba out of the archives where they aren't really accessible, particularly under our FIA laws here, the Personal Health Information Act, and make them accessible to community. And we started just with that, and the project, there's been such a demand for the project that it has expanded exponentially, and we're just about to launch an oral history program, which we weren't planning on doing, but we've had so many survivors and family members contact us and ask us to tell their stories that, you know, if that's what they want us to do, that's what we're going to do. So we face a lot of the similar challenges you've been outlining, including, you know, recruiting people to sit on the our advisory committee. One of our goals is to bring together survivor groups, because right now there is no connections at all in any way that are formal between Indigenous TB patients in Manitoba. There's no Facebook groups, there's no organizations, there's nothing. And part of the problem we've been facing is that the stigma that's attached to tuberculosis continues to be so strong, and particularly in Indigenous communities, that it was a dirty disease. That on one part, these histories just have not been passed down from generation to generation in large part. Some, you know, kids don't even know their parents were in the sanatoriums because it's just not really talked about in families. So is that issue is that it's not talked about. So, you know, Krista talked about their survivors group, you know, started being active in 1981. Like that's amazing. All of the knowledge that's been gained and saved over that time. Whereas with where we are now, the oldest survivor I've met was in the sanatoriums when they were 15, and most of them much younger than that. So we're facing sort of a time issue dealing with this. We're facing sort of this issue around stigma and getting people to sort of come forward, although as the word spreads, we get, you know, we get so many requests and contacts and stuff. So people are willing to talk about it to us, but not necessarily yet in their communities. We're still sort of trying to figure out what is happening with that. And then we have no physical space. So our project is myself and my research partner, who's a faculty member, and we just brought on a postdoc. And we literally just have our 2 staff offices, and that's it. So we are fully digital because we have no place to store records at all. And we are just a research project. We are not an archive. So we don't even know what's really going to happen to our database once our funding ends. We're about to launch a website in January that will have all of the photos we've collected from multiple archives and private donations online, searchable, and it will allow community to add to the descriptions of the photos and things like that. But we have to figure out what we are going to do with that accumulated knowledge and database once our CIHR funding runs out in 2 years. So this has been a really interesting conversation between the 2 of you, because even though we're sort of all dealing with different topics, a lot of the challenges that especially MiCA and I are facing as sort of a young projects are very similar. And I will be emailing Krista to get her advice on some issues that we are facing. So thanks for this. It's been really a really useful thing to listen to.
Thanks so much, Erin. And always happy to chat. So feel free to send that email.
Thank you, Erin, for that. You're doing such important work, and I think I don't know if this will help at all, but you know, MiCA itself, the Muslims in Canada Archive, was started off as what you called like a faculty project, like a research project. Technically, that's how the university saw it in the beginning. I think you know, small I don't want to say, yeah, small community archival, you know, these what do they call like digital humanities style projects have been very popular at the university. I'm sure, you know, Canada wide, it's just a very growing field. And we were considered a more of a digital humanities public history type of project, and you know, the university generally thought we would, you know, maybe die off in a year or two once our funding ended. So we're trying to transition out of that, you know, the research project, faculty project model. Right now we have, you know, the director of the Institute of Islamic Studies, Professor Iman. He's been working very, very hard to fundraise with the university, fundraise with the community, to make sure that this project doesn't just rely on government grants, because we are currently relying on a small seed grant right now. So that has been a big challenge, but we were very, very fortunate to find someone in our advancement, the university's advancement team, that is very passionate about this project and is working really hard with us to fundraise and make sure that this is, kind of moves away from, fully kind of breaks off from being just a research project of a faculty member, and it becomes an archive in its own right in the university. So I don't know if your faculty, the faculty member that is part of your project, might be able to talk to any advancement team at the that they're connected to, or that the university is connected to. But we were very lucky to find that person that was very kind of dedicated to this project. So I understand where you're at right now. I think it has been a lot of work to kind of legitimize this project, and make sure that people understand, the university understands how important it is. We've had to not only one of the ways we kind of do try to legitimize ourselves as an archive and not a research project is we have made a lot of great relationships with archives outside of the university. So, Library Archives Canada, we've the Provincial Archives of Ontario as well. Like we've made really great connections there, and have had them get involved in some of our processes. Give us advice and things like that. And at the same time, we've also made a lot of great connections with community organizations as well. All of this just to ensure that the university understands that we are an archive, and there are a lot of stakeholders involved, people that are interested in this project, existing in perpetuity, as we like to say. So I don't know if that helped, but I hope it helped a little bit.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Oh, yes, we have another hand up. Please go ahead.
Oh, well, first of all, thank you very much, Krista, if I may, and also MiCA, if I may, for organizing this. Super interesting and really nice to hear about the work that's being done at the Shingwauk Residential School Centre. So I have a couple of questions. The first, I was wondering if any teachers or those involved in building curricula have been consulting the collections or the information, the archive in general, and you did mention the example of Fran Fletcher Luther. So I was wondering, have folks been coming to consult in that sense?
So we actually work with educators a lot. So both elementary, high school, and post-secondary. Part of that is through, we offer formal education and outreach programming. Some of that's doing site tours, talks with survivors. We do also have partnerships with specific post-secondary professors who are integrating content from the archive into their classroom assignments and their curriculum more broadly. So I'd say definitely yes, and we're always open to people contacting us for new collaborations.
Great, thank you. And if I may, I had a second question too. It was really interesting also to hear about the example of the photograph of the dorm and how there were efforts made to ensure that the community gave their consent to have those photographs. I was wondering, is there also an ongoing process to check in with community to basically, is there a process to see if what has been shown previously is no longer okay to show or even to keep, and how would that work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd say the Reclaiming Shingwauk Hall exhibit, it's only been up since 2018. So we haven't done any formal check-ins, mostly because we're still working on the next phase of that exhibit. But I could see ourselves doing check-ins on that larger permanent exhibit every 5 years or so, just recognizing the capacity to change that content is somewhat limited. That being said, there's some digital components that are integrated into that exhibit that can be changed on a rotating basis. And we do get feedback on that and update it on an ongoing basis.
Thank you so much.
So we did have a question in the chat, not entirely related to community archives, but Carol's asking, wait, I lose the question. Carol just wondering if you had any paranormal experiences in your job.
I haven't personally, but some people have. There's definitely significance to the site that we're on, and people, see and feel different things connected to it.
Oh, hi, Skyly. You can go ahead.
Can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry, it's the microphone input. It sometimes doesn't work on Zoom. But thank you, Krista, for the presentation, the overview. I always love hearing about the work of the center and kind of getting that refresh of some of the different things. Just kind of like bouncing off of the last question, I wonder if there's been any updating to when outside researchers request to access the collection. Is there a process you need to go through to check with community or to check with survivors if that material can be accessed? And do you often ask what the research project end goals are?
Yeah, and so it kind of depends on what collections people are looking at accessing. There's some that have been declared like open access that are publicly available online, but people who are looking to do more in-depth research, we're typically asking them to write a letter to the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association, outlining what their research is, and then they get approval from CSAA to do that work. So particularly if someone's looking to do, say, a master's thesis or a PhD dissertation or write an article, then we're really asking that they engage with community in a meaningful way. If they're looking to engage with survivors on an ongoing basis, then they'd be going through the research ethics board as well.
Thank you, Krista.
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. And then, although MiCA only recently received like the first few donations, it's definitely something I'm thinking about, and I'm trying to figure out how to do for the community for the Muslims in Canada archive as well. One thing we did kind of push for at MiCA is including a digitization section so that donors can mention if they want anything digitized or put up online or not, so they have the ability to differentiate between restrictions on access and also restrictions on putting things online too. So and we are trying to figure out ways to make sure that people feel comfortable, because I do get a lot of pushback from the community, worried about how things will be interpreted, how things will look like, and the Muslim communities is just very much targeted in terms of national surveillance. So there's a lot of a lot of people are scared about how their records will be looked at and who's going to look at them. So we're trying different ways to figure that out too. So Luke, I saw that you, yes, I figured you turned on your camera because you had a question. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, and thank you both for the presentation. I just had kind of a nuts and bolts question about Shingwauk. So how, as an archivist, does it approach the arrangement and description of its records? Like, is it using RAD or an Indigenous classification system like Brian Deere, or something else entirely?
Yeah, so we use RAD for description of our archival records. I'd say we use RAD fairly loosely, and the notes field tends to get used pretty heavily. The arrangement piece, I'd say, isn't necessarily using standard arrangement. The one example that I point to is at one point there was a bunch of records that fell under a principals collection. They were organized by time period of when each principal was at the residential school. After feedback that was essentially saying, like, we don't want to see the principal's name every time we have to access these records, those collections got shifted to being by decade. And so organized in a bit of a different way. We do have some library holdings as well. Right now, only a small percentage of them have been cataloged, and it's been using Library of Congress. That being said, there is a plan to shift our library holdings to Brian Deere. My colleague Jenna LeMay is kind of working on a plan for what that would look like.
Okay, thank you for your answer. If it's all right, I do have a second question. I'm in a course on library service in Indigenous communities right now, and a topic that keeps coming up is the repatriation of Indigenous materials and the difficulty that can attach to that process. Has Shingwauk had to perform any repatriations, and if so, how has that process been?
To my knowledge, no. Partially because a lot of our records are coming from community. In some cases, we have done digital repatriation, or what you could call digital repatriation, in that we're actively sharing records back with community. I'd say if it ever came up that we had records that were connected to a community, we would definitely have a conversation with them and with the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association to kind of figure out the best path forward.
Just to add on to that, Krista, I thought I think you mentioned probably not getting the date right, but I think you're in the early 2000s. There you had that photo album, those photo albums, and I thought it was very, very interesting where that the center allowed folks to just like write into the photo albums, and then I was wondering, would those, once those photo albums were, the annotations were added into there, were they like photocopied and then sent out to
yeah. So the process initially was just to update the photo albums. They're actually PowerPoint presentations, and so just updating the text in them with the new names that were recorded. Since that time, we've actually made it so that there's a connection between the photo albums and the archival record too. That wasn't initially in the project, but it now is, so that when we get a new name, it goes back to both revise the album, but then also to revise the archival record.
Oh, okay. And another question that came up from all these really great questions for me was, so essentially anything that enters the residential, the archive comes from donations from the Alumni Association. Is that correct?
So we get donations from a wide range of people.
Okay.
Some
So
are
it's
from
not
survivors, some are from former staff, some are from relatives of staff. Yeah.
Okay, but is it the association that sort of I don't know, approves them, or like it lends some sort of context to them, or
So they often lend that context piece,
Yeah.
particularly if the records are missing the context, turning to survivors to ask, like, do you know what this batch of photos might be connected to, things like that.
Okay, all right, okay, thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions? Oh, Carol has another question here in the chat. So just wondering how the community makes decisions, like what photographs should be displayed. Is it a majority decision?
Yeah, and so the children of Shingwauk have always operated on a consensus basis. And so that sometimes can take a while. Sometimes it's, multiple day-long meetings to come to consensus, but that's how their practice has always worked.
Is it the same for exhibit? Oh, sorry to cut you off.
Yep.
I
And
was just going to ask if it's the same for exhibits as well.
Yeah, and so the exhibit piece, we did work with a couple of external curators for the Reclaiming Shingwauk Hall exhibition, but all the photos and all the text either went through survivors for approval or they helped pick it out.
Okay, thank you. So we do have time for maybe one more question if anybody has any more questions. Okay. Just going to wait a few seconds in case anybody's typing something furiously in the chat. Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, I did want to just share my screen. Why does this never work when you want it to? Okay. Right, so I did want to share some of our some contact information here for all of you. So I want to thank everyone so very much for joining us today. Obviously, especially want to thank Krista for sharing their wealth of knowledge, experience, and expertise, and for taking the time to talk to me about community archives. I really don't get to do it with another community archivist very often. Thank you all for your insightful questions as well. So these just on the screen here, there's just some information on how you can contact us and Krista, the Shingwauk Residential School Centre, myself, and also just MiCA, the Muslims in Canada Archive in general. But again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I'm going to stop the recording just now.